My first time seeing the Farlands was through Ant Venom's videos back when I started playing the game. Something about the shattered liminal space was alluring, seeing the fabric of the game's terrain be slowly twisted and shredded the further you went out. I've always had a sort of fascination with it over the years, so now I'm finally taking the time to explore them myself. The Farlands were a bug that existed in the game from InfDev when infinite procedural generation was added, all the way to its removal in Beta 1.8. They were caused by integer overflow in the noise generation. You can see the fix here in the Perlin noise class. All of the places where the noise is created and processed is passed through this wrap method, where the value is never able to surpass the integer limit and still retains a sort of uniform randomness that makes the terrain look normal. So obviously you can change this with the mixin. As far as reintroducing the Farlands in their original form, literally all you need to do is bypass this return statement and change it to return the original value unchanged. Now, with no guardrail, the Farlands will spawn just as they did before the Beta 1.8 patch. Pretty much any mods that reintroduce the Farlands into modern versions, like Farlands Reborn, use this method. And it's pretty funny that after all these years, there's only one line of code preventing the Farlands from generating. The patterning of the wall in modern versions is mostly flat, but occasionally you will see these patterns of rectangular holes in the sides. I'm not entirely sure what causes them to spawn or not spawn, but it looks cool when they do. Beyond the face of the wall, the surface of the terrain is mostly cohesive, just raised to the upper build limit. All the oceans are changed into these strange empty fields of grass, and you also see hints of these strange linear passages. But other than that, it's pretty ordinary. If you go out 30 million blocks, you'll find the world border like any other world. Most of the really game-breaking Farlands parts aren't millions, but billions of blocks out. That would require some more hacky methods to reach. But anyways, that got me thinking. I was already altering the return statement, so I can basically do whatever I want in this method. Let's break it. The first thing I wanted to try changing was the position of the Farlands. The scalar value for the noise amplitude is 173.103. I'll call this the noise constant for the rest of the video. I'm not the first person to discover this value. It's been known for quite a while, and it's derived by dividing the 32-bit integer limit by the Farland's position, giving you the per block change in noise amplitude, and it's basically present in every calculation. This means that for every block you move away from the origin, the noise amplitude increases by this much. So, if you want to trigger the Farlands in different positions, all you gotta do is push the noise value over the 32-bit integer limit at the specific place you desire. Here, I'm moving it to 10,000 blocks by taking the difference needed and adding it to the noise value. This is what it looks like mathematically. Using this method, you can move it genuinely wherever you want, even very close to spawn. If you put it close enough to spawn, the sky Farlands actually start to become visible, so that's pretty cool. For Farlands that are farther than the original value of 12,550,823, I scaled down the noise scaling past the first breakpoint so that it would be delayed. Here are the Farlands at 25 million blocks away. The big thing I really wanted to mess around with was the noise itself. Theoretically, if I multiplied the value, I could sort of progress through the Farlands generation in less space, so I tried it. First with an exponential approach. The scaling looks like this. The exponent increases by 2 for every 1 million blocks, and the base is the 32-bit integer limit. I restricted the scaling to only happen after the wall positions so that it doesn't break the pre-Farlands terrain generation. This led to some very interesting results. For whatever reason, X and Z axis behave differently. I have no idea why, but for now I'll just look at each separately. Because of the differences in scaling, I actually injected a bit of code into the getValue method here that would make the internal X and Z values global so I can use them from the wrap method and potentially scale each differently. When I implemented noise limits in terms of these X and Y values instead of the raw noise, to my surprise, the face of the wall changed shape and I got this very interesting pattern, significantly improving the bare and frankly boring wall of the modern Farlands, so I kept it around. For the X-axis Farlands, the terrain appears normally for a good while. After around 2 million blocks, you begin to see some random 4x4 block square errors in the terrain with increasing regularity. At 14,793,872 blocks from spawn, the increasingly broken terrain hits a breakpoint and you begin to see the fartherlands, sparse striped terrain in 4-block wide strips alongside individual 4x4 block floating islands. With the lack of solid land, the lava layer fill becomes a world-spanning flat lake at y equals -53, and the water level fills the entire world from y equals 63. As the world generation continues, the remaining terrain becomes more and more sparse. By the time you reach the world barrier, the terrain has almost completely disappeared, leaving nothing but the endless void of liquids and floating structures that I call the moat. On the z-axis, it's much the same at the start. very stable until around 14,794,000 blocks, where the 4x4 square errors start appearing, first rarely, then gradually taking over the terrain. At 28,550,820 blocks from spawn, the farther lands begin generating in the z-axis, in much the same way as the x-axis, but more densely packed. The farther lands become increasingly more sparse as you continue, just like the x-axis, and by the time you reach the world border, only the occasional floating 4x4 terrain is visible within the moat. The corner farland sort of breaks down in the same general way. I tested the exponential scaling with the other farlands positions and got more or less the same result, so there's not really much to see there. Next, I tried with the linear approach, just multiplying the noise directly. Given the absurdly large numbers that the exponential was creating, I figured small values like 10 or 100 would basically have no effect on the scaling, so I started with 1 quadrillion, or 10 to the 15. Although there was some odder generation than normal, by the world border not much had changed, so I gradually increased the orders of magnitude of the linear scaler. Not much happened until around 10 to the 40 when I started seeing 4x4 errors in the corner farlands close to the world border. You also start seeing structuring of a large layered terrain that the classic corner farlands are known for. The regular generation was more or less normal. Increasing it further eventually caused the x-axis farlands to completely break around 10 to the 42, with the z-axis having a more gradual change up to about 10 to the 70 when it really breaks. Around here is when I started to experiment with shorter farlands distances and began to see an interesting pattern. In spite of the fact that mathematically the farlands progression should look the same regardless of the position, the linear scaling changed drastically between different farlands positions. So, I reverted the linear scaler back to 10 to the 15 and tested it on different positions. From here on out, most of the generation is actually nearly perfectly square, and the x and z differences somehow disappear despite their previous behavior. At 1,500,000 blocks away, there weren't much changes from the regular vanilla farlands generation, but at 100,000 blocks away, you started to see more of the straight patterning by the world border, as well as some rough corner farland structures at the corner world border. At 50,000 blocks away, it gets a lot more interesting as you begin to generate the start of the fartherlands at 16.8 million blocks out, and fully generated corner farlands around the same distance. At 10,000, you get the most interesting result, relatively normal until around 300,000 blocks, where you start to see the square holes and some linear patterns. Around 3.3 million blocks, those linear patterns become more pronounced and start forming the striped patterns of the fartherlands. These eventually lose detail and density the further out you go. Around the same distance, the corner farlands begin to form, and by around 3.5 million blocks out, they appear fully formed. Eventually, at 13,444,532 blocks from spawn, there is a sheer wall of stone where the generation ends. Past this is the moat with massive broken pillars just beyond it. In the corner, you can see a direct cut through the landscape with layers of the corner farlands visible from the sides. I continued to test the linear farlands by moving it 1,000 blocks from spawn and found the same structuring and the moat at exactly 1,344,453 blocks out, or 1/10 of the distance of the 10,000 block one. I'm not sure what causes this behavior at the moment, but that's what I'm observing. If you shrink it to smaller and smaller sizes, you're just going to see closer and closer scaling of this structure. If you move it to 1 block from spawn, you get this 2600 by 2600 square island where everything is farlands. It's pretty interesting and might make for a cool map idea. I also tried messing around with a sign function, and it gives you more or less what you'd expect. I threw it into the mod anyways if people want to mess around with it. Speaking of which, after messing around with all of this for a good while, I started working on making all of these farlands adjustments into proper features. I mixed into the Create World screen and added some buttons so that you can select settings from the World Create screen. Then I ended up setting up a per world config. I ended up making it work through the dimension data storage, and it means that every world saves its own farlands position when it's set, so you don't have to worry about changing the global config when you change worlds. As far as the global config, it is accessible from the main menu, and you can set the value to literally whatever you want. From there, you can set the world creation to use the config value, and it will use that custom value instead of one of the preset ones. The mod is out now on CurseForge if you'd like to try it out. I definitely want to experiment more with this in the future, but for now I'll leave it in its current state, and I encourage everyone to experiment with it themselves. I hope you enjoyed the video.